Welcome back, everyone. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, James. Welcome, everyone, to It's Yours, Democratizing Cultural Heritage with Open Access. If you want to hear from the National Gallery, join track 2. My name is Alex Cron, and I'm the Digital Operations and Collections Information Analyst for the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, or BPOC. I'm here to moderate this session. Before I introduce Douglas McCarthy from Europeana, I'd like to remind attendees to type questions into the Q&A box at any point throughout the session. An art historian by academic training, Douglas has worked internationally in museums, art collections, and archives for 20 years. He is a passionate advocate for open access to cultural heritage, and his areas of expertise include digital collections management, copyright, and licensing. At Europeana, Douglas leads a team working with international museum and educational partners to showcase their collections and engage online audiences with cultural heritage, digital storytelling, and dynamic content marketing. In his own right, Douglas is a respected researcher and author in the field of open access to cultural heritage. Since 2018, he has led an international survey of open access policy and practice in the GLAM sector with Dr. Andrea Wallace of the University of Exeter in the UK. Douglas is also the editor of the medium publication Open GLAM that shares insights into open access and cultural heritage from a global perspective. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Douglas for his presentation.
Thanks, Alex, for the nice introduction, and good evening from the Netherlands, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And please come on to the audio, Alex, if you don't see that clearly. So, welcome everybody. For the next few minutes, I'd like to give you a brief, hopefully informative global tour of what we call Open GLAM, which is all about open access to cultural heritage, particularly digital cultural heritage, and to show you the landscape of what Open GLAM looks like today, and some of the leading innovators. I'll show some examples, and also share with you some of the opportunities that I think open access represents for museum professionals, and also some of the challenges which still exist. These slides will be publicly available on open access terms immediately after this presentation. So let's get underway. Our agenda for the next few minutes is, first of all, I'd like to just cover what is Open GLAM for those of you who may not be familiar with this space. I'd like to demonstrate why Open GLAM is important, really why it matters, share some examples of Europeana's role, which is my current employer, and also some of those opportunities and challenges which I mentioned. So the first thing to remember, I think, is that Open GLAM is really a movement. It's a global community of organizations, museums, libraries, archives, universities, many others, and people who are working to open up their content, typically collections and data held by GLAMs, where culturally appropriate to do so. That's a note we'll come on to a little bit later. And the core principle, the mantra, if you want to repeat this to yourself or get it on a t-shirt, is that reproductions of public domain works should remain in the public domain when they are digitized. So when an engraving is scanned or a painting is photographed, it really should be, when the digital file is created, it should still be a public domain work. It shouldn't have new forms of copyrights layered or asserted in it. And within the European Union, from whence I'm speaking, the threshold of copyright relying on signs of the author's own intellectual creation in the resulting digitized work is a really important principle that was recently reaffirmed at a directive level. Open means that anyone can freely access, use, modify and share content for any purpose. This is a sentence lifted from the open definition developed by Open Knowledge International some years ago. And this really encapsulates what open access is. Free access and free reuse is critical. Just being able to look at something but not reuse it is definitely not open access. A brief sojourn into copyright and licensing. Sorry, but this is necessary. So Open GLAM compliant legal tools and licenses. Here are a few of the main ones to think about the public domain mark, the Creative Commons CC0 dedication into the public domain, then a couple of other Creative Commons license flavors, the attribution license, CC BY, and the attribution share-alike, CC BY SA. These are all Open GLAM compliant legal tools. And there are a number of variations of what we call no known copyright, which also qualify, which also enable people to be as liberal and free in reusing content as I've just described. It's worth noting that non-commercial or no derivative flavors of the Creative Commons licenses or their equivalents in terms of use are not Open GLAM. They really are too restrictive to be considered open access by the Open GLAM community. Since 2018, almost exactly 4 years ago, my friend and colleague Dr. Andrea Wallace from the University of Exeter have been surveying open access, how GLAMs make open access data, metadata, text, digital objects available for reuse on open access terms. A link here is on the screen to bit.ly/OpenGLAM survey. And this is essentially a gigantic spreadsheet which records in ever-increasing detail how, where, when and how cultural heritage institutions are publishing or have published open access data. This research enables us to output a global picture of Open GLAM today. What you see on screen is a map visualization generated from Wikidata, which many of you will be familiar with. The Open GLAM survey is annotated in great detail in Wikidata, so that allows it to be queried in lots of creative and interesting ways. Headline for you tonight is that there are so far over 1,400 instances of open access institutions globally, and over 78 million openly licensed digital objects from those institutions. So yes, plenty to be going with, but there is still much room for growth, which we'll come on to. Where do you find Open GLAM content? Well, here are some of the major sources. First of all, museum websites, for example, like the Rijksmuseum and the Cleveland Museum of Art, who appeared yesterday at yesterday's event, are of course go-to places to find, download and use this material. Cultural data aggregators like Europeana, like Japan Search, like Trove in Australia, and many, many others are also really important platforms for bringing together and publishing open access material, as is of course Wikimedia Commons, that repository, Flickr Commons, and other areas like Sketchfab is great for totally open access 3D digital objects from museums. And there are a number of important hackathons over the years, like Coding Da Vinci in Germany and open data portals, which have also been important sort of fountainheads for Open GLAM material. Here are one or two examples just to share with you what Open GLAM really looks like. This is one of my favorites. It's National Palace Museum in Taiwan. They went Open GLAM in 2015, and they use a Taiwanese specific open data government license to do so. This is roughly equivalent to the CC BY attribution license. And they have released all of their eligible data. Eligible means material that was digitized, which copyright has expired in or didn't exist in the first place. And the National Palace Museum really has an all-encompassing open data policy for all of its metadata, digital objects, a great API, and even a special collection for Animal Crossing lovers. So really, what more could you want? Traveling around the world, this is an example of a partnership with the Wikimedia group in Brazil and publication to the Wikimedia Commons platform of some fantastic photographs of sort of anatomical models, veterinary material from a museum in Sao Paulo. This material has been published since 2015 and is available under the CC BY SA, the attribution and share-alike license. And going to Australia to visit Museums Victoria, a fantastic natural science and humanities collection, all kinds of zoology, paleontology, and much more. This is a great resource for public domain and CC BY material with over 150,000 images the last time I counted. And what's really outstanding about Museums Victoria is not this frightening looking animal, but the way that the museum actually communicates open access. This is a critical point of Open GLAM, that as cultural heritage institutions and professionals, we must make it as easy as possible, to be as clear as possible to online audiences and let them know what they can and sometimes what they can't do with the materials that we are presenting online. So Museums Victoria here, you may be able to see a nice icon for reuse image. I'll zoom in slightly. The museum interface presents download image size options, which is really great. It gives you clear attribution information for the museum's photographer, links to the Creative Commons license, and gives you the optional extra of letting the museum know what you'd like to do, what you intend to do with the image, but not forcing you to do so, importantly. And yeah, the citation and the rights information for all of their digital objects, this example here, is first class. So if you're thinking about Open GLAM or you're doing it already, then Museums Victoria is a great example to follow. This is really important because without standardized licensing like the Creative Commons licenses, it's incredibly complex and quite boring actually for users to have to read your terms and conditions. So too long didn't read is actually a reality, unfortunately, for a lot of museums. This is a visualization of word count of terms of use from a selection of GLAMs, and topping the charts here, possibly not in a good way, is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, whose terms of use run to almost 4,000 words. So I'm going to suggest to you that this is probably not a great user experience, and the Creative Commons licenses, for example, are a fantastic shortcut that signal to users pretty much immediately what they can and can't do with your content. Another aspect of Open GLAM, which is very interesting and is growing, is it allows you to measure engagement digitally with your collections. Jane Alexander from Cleveland spoke yesterday and may have presented this, but if not, I'm going to do so because I'm a huge fan. This is the virtual Cleveland Museum of Art dashboards. This allows you to see how many times different collections objects or departments of collections have been viewed from the museum, but also importantly to see how much these collections, this material has been engaged with, for example, on Wikipedia. So a really kind of forward thinking beyond our museum approach to digital and engagement. Open GLAM on the web is also really important because, as you know, open data, for example, material from Wikidata, powers the digital services, the phones in our hand, voice services like Alexa and Siri, Google's Knowledge Graph. This runs on and relies on open access metadata to improve our everyday life, hopefully. So using open access art material, and this is an example here from the Metropolitan Museum, about using AI and open data to connect their collections with other open collections around the world, has got great possibilities. In terms of transparency, open data can play a really important role, as can crowdsourcing. And crowdsourcing is really, I think, transforming the role and the status of memory institutions, of GLAMs at the moment. So here I've just put up a picture of the Musée d'Orsay's item page for the Déjeuner sur l'herbe by Edouard Manet, which is interesting. It shows you the basic essentials. But if you compare it to the equivalent page on Wikipedia, so this is French Wikipedia up here, this is far, far more extensive, goes into a lot more detail and has some very interesting knowledge, which isn't presented by the museum. And also the article is available in many other different languages. So open access can be a great tool when you connect to Wikimedia for allowing your collections and your knowledge about them to be shared in many more languages than the museum could themselves. And finally, just to note that, we are aware that the internet, social media and knowledge platforms like the Wikipedia projects are very dynamic and contested, but there is at least a clear, transparent revision history, so you can see who's made what changes when, and that's something which you cannot always say of museum collections and websites themselves. Ethics are, of course, a critical and a growing part of Open GLAM. that I could talk much more about, but here's just one example. This is from an Africa-centered approach to restitution of data and objects led by a project based in Africa by Taiwan or headstronghistorian.com, which is really inviting communities and stakeholders to be part of decision making around collections, restoration and open access or not to them. So this sort of much more ground up approach is critical and very, very welcome. Our friends at Creative Commons have rebooted and launched their Open GLAM program with a focus on better sharing, which I think is a nice framing. This includes work on copyright and open access policies, development in infrastructure and capacity building. They have a GLAM certificate program that you can sign up to become knowledgeable and certified as a GLAM and Open GLAM expert, and a big focus on community engagement. And this is really global with Creative Commons. So great to see this happening. At Europeana, we try to be part of a positive digital public space. And since our foundation 12 years ago, openness and trustworthiness have been really embedded across our organization and our networks. We publish all of our metadata on the website as CC0. Open access and data values are really kind of woven into our fabric. And digitally, we are strong believers in standardizing metadata and rights statements, the importance of linked open data and vocabularies, much used at Europeana, and more generally supporting working with the cultural heritage sector in its ongoing digital transformation. The Europeana website, which was referenced earlier by my colleague Marika, offers access to over 50 million items from more than 3,500 museums around Europe. Worth saying that over 25 million, so just over half of the objects in Europeana are on open access terms. The website is available in all 24 working official languages of the European Union, and it was visited over 5 million times last year. If you haven't checked it out, please do so, and feedback is always welcome. Education is a critical part of Open GLAM, the opportunity, and our work at Europeana. So we have a number of major European partners who we work with to create learning scenarios, stories of implementation that teachers, educators can use, focusing on open access source collections. We have a really great MOOC, which we've run now for a few years, and lots of participatory workshops, tools, and tutorials. So really marrying open culture, open heritage with educators and students to maximize that opportunity. Storytelling on Europeana is a really important part of my team's work and my work. We have an archive of over 1,000 blogs and online exhibitions. All of the text in these is openly reusable and openly licensed. And these are developed mostly with our amazing range of guest partners and authors on all kinds of subjects. So again, please feel welcome to check it out. So far so good. You're feeling hopefully happy. This is the land of milk and honey, and this really is a great time to start discovering, enjoying and using digital cultural heritage. However, let me just point out a couple of thorns in the rose garden, which you should be aware of. The Open GLAM movement at the moment is still a minority of museum practice. It's the exception, it isn't the rule, and here's just one example. So the wonderful and famous Anna Feeney portrait, created by Jan van Eyck, almost 600 years ago in 1432, and currently in the possession of the National Gallery in London. Well, if you visit the gallery's website, as I'm sure you have, and I hope you will, you'll see a copyright is asserted in this in a relatively straightforward, simple photograph of the painting. Is there any obvious evidence of the gallery's own intellectual creation or imprint on the painting? I'm going to suggest not. But what you'll find is that this copyright assertion and also the Creative Commons license applied with it, which is non-commercial, no derivative, really restricts what you can do, even if you do proceed to download an 800 pixel image. So just on kind of basic level of access and connection, these kind of policies, apart from eliciting surprised responses in Kento the monkey and me, really are something which go back to the sort of analog and the pre-digital era, and that we really hope and like to see change. Further down the rabbit hole, one can, as my friend and colleague Andrea Wallace has, examine how public domain masterpieces like the La Gioconda, which existed and was created before copyright was even invented, are now mediated across the web. Andrea's research highlighted over 100 digital surrogates of the Mona Lisa from over 30 different institutions, and there is a whole thicket, a labyrinth here of format shifting, terms of use, different copyright claims, legal contexts, incomplete information. Basically, it's a bit of a nightmare. But the opportunity of this is for institutions who have these works, the Louvre in this case, that through open access, they can actually much more deliberately and clearly communicate and rise above this noise, should they decide to. So this sort of what we call NooGlam, with a kind of smile on our face in the open GLAM community, the non-open access, does actually have quite deleterious, negative, real-world consequences. So in the UK, a couple of examples here. These are publications about how museum image fees, the cost and the whole process of acquiring images from non-open access institutions is incredibly expensive, and it really is a tax on scholarship and new knowledge, and has ended up distorting the art history field, where non-open collections are actually sort of overlooked, and people naturally are going to open access collections like the Rijksmuseum or the Met to get their images and to focus on their research. So open GLAM actually is really a real thing and is costly. So let's just remember what GLAMs are for. Here's a word cloud of things from a mix of museum mission statements. They talk about enjoyment, understanding, developing community, sharing information, all lots of kind of nice fluffy things that we I think all sign up for. But when you contrast that to sort of non-open access image policies and think about how that supports or rather doesn't the mission of GLAMs, there's a lot of food for thought and reflection there. So what are the challenges to open GLAM at the moment? Here is a quick summary. First of all, there's a scarcity of human, economic and technical resources. Open GLAM is quite intense and found in the rich world, in Western Europe and in North America, but much less so in many other and most of the world. So it very much mirrors many other parts of life. Modern copyright is really a problem. A lot of it is driven by vested interests, so corporates, multinationals, publishers and rights holders. And that's expressed, for example, in the ad nauseam continuing, seemingly never-ending term extension of copyright, and also the incredible complexity and lack of standardization of copyright regimes around the world. Within museums themselves, there is, of course, pressure on them to generate money, to sweat their digital assets for revenue to feed back into the museums. That's, of course, that's understandable. And what I call power of the status quo. So it is much easier for museums, generally speaking, to continue with operations rather than embark on imaginative new forms of leadership and, for example, open access. So particularly larger institutions can suffer from a stasis around policy and practice. So in conclusion, Open GLAM matters because it makes cultural heritage accessible and reusable. For museums, it drives digital reach and creates more visibility opportunities. And it fundamentally agrees with the purpose of museums, what they exist for. Within institutions, it can be really transformative. So you can be smarter around your resource allocation. People that used to spend hours and hours and hours emailing about loss-making image licensing services can be redeployed to cataloging and speaking to audiences and help and servicing them. And it also communicates a very positive intent to online audiences. It's part of an outward-looking good footprint and imprint for museums. And fundamentally, Open GLAM empowers education, creativity and new forms of knowledge. So with that, I thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you for that, Douglas, for that dive into open access in the GLAMs field. So now it's time for the Q&A portion of the session. It looks like we have a couple questions already. I'll start with the first one. Douglas, what do you think is the best strategy to engage a cultural institution that is not keen on opening up their collections?
Great question. something that I've done personally, and it has worked, is approaching, usually, for example, not on social media, but more privately, is contacting the museum and politely inquiring or expressing a kind of use case that you have. For example, it might be a project, a book project, an online project that you're working on, and to inquire about of course, the availability of the content that you want to use, the images. Maybe you need high-res images, and those conversations can be a way to develop a dialogue about copyright policy and access. Last year, I was in touch with quite a major museum in Canada about this. I was gently querying behind the scenes their assertion of copyright in what were basically scans of glass plate negatives from 100 years ago. And within my understanding of the Canadian copyright regime, I say, well, actually, I think pretty sure this is public domain. And I was actually very happy for someone to reply and say, yeah, you're right, actually, and we're in the process of changing it, and we'll let you know when we have. So I'm not saying that can scale or that can work all the time, but I'd say at least as a first step, that's one stratagem that you can take, is to start a dialogue and see where it leads.
Thank you. So we have another question. How common is it to charge a cost recovery access fee to high resolution digital images or docs, but where any use or copyright fees are not charged? Or is that completely outside of the scope of open access?
So that's a good one, because that's what I call a sort of hybrid open GLAM policy. And you do see this quite often, actually. I saw a new one the other day where the pretty decent, I'd say medium resolution open access images are available for download, kind of no questions asked, from the museum's website. Fantastic. That's probably good enough for most uses. But this particular museum, and other museums do the same, has reserved a higher resolution image, which it would charge for, request remuneration for, in order to supply. How legitimate is that? Well, that's really a matter of opinion. Of course, there are certain costs associated around digital storage, although maybe they're possibly less than they were, say, 5 years ago. So that kind of hybrid open access certainly does exist, and it's quite commonly seen when a museum is first embarking on open access. It takes sort of baby steps, which again is totally reasonable, and it has a sort of hybrid policy, rather than going totally, hey everybody, everything CC0, and here's the high-res files for you to access. So it depends on the context.
I'm just looking at the chat. There's some discussion around the Latin American context, and it looks like Croatia as well, that there's some comments around cultural works not being well retributed, and that some workers think open access to their materials and research is stealing their work. I don't know if you have any thoughts around those comments.
Yeah, sure. Well, from the museum's perspective, and I speak as someone who managed copyright and licensing at National Museum in a previous life, it's totally legitimate and understandable that museums do want to keep, for example, their, wherever possible, like attribution, right? Their name, the name of the institution, to be, as an artist or an author would, right, to be credited properly for work, and to have it appear wherever the images are used. I think that's a fair impulse. However, where I do slightly draw a line around that is that when material genuinely enters, or always has been, within the public domain, and for example, Creative Commons 0, public domain dedication is used, or the public domain mark. Now, in that scenario, attribution is not required. It is not mandatory. It's not necessary. However, people usually will attribute sources. That's the most common behavior, because it's kind of a nice thing and it feels like a right thing to do. Of course, that's common practice in, for example, in academia, in other creative fields. So there are cases where attribution is required around one of the attribution flavor licenses from Creative Commons, but it isn't always necessary, and it shouldn't always be expected.
Thank you for that, Douglas. Unfortunately, we are about at time, so I'm going to say thank you, and thank you to everyone for attending. Up next here in track 2, we'll hear about the rich historical collections of HSBC online, or you can head to track 1 and learn about how the Henry Ford uses its collections management system as a sort of dams for collections multimedia. See you in about 5 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.